In the quiet embrace of Cedar Creek, a town nestled in the misty foothills of the Appalachian Mountains of Virginia, life unfolded with a gentle rhythm, as predictable and comforting as the morning fog. Neighbors knew each other's stories. Trust was woven into the fabric of their daily routines, and the ordinary sights rarely warranted a second glance. But one April morning, the familiar tapestry of their lives began to unravel, ever so subtly. A silent, elusive figure began to materialize. Near the storm drains behind the town's unassuming shops, a bobcat, its frame thin and restless, moved in a way that defied easy explanation. It appeared with the soft blush of dawn and again in the fading light of dusk, pacing with a quiet desperation, watching, always returning to the same uninviting spot as if tethered by invisible threads of instinct and a hidden heartbreak. To most of Cedar Creek's residents, it was merely a fleeting glimpse of the wild world encroaching upon their ordered lives. But to Annie Caldwell, a lifelong local with a keen eye for detail and a heart that instinctively leaned towards the vulnerable, there was something different about this particular bobcat, something profoundly unsettling in its desperate movements. What was this wild creature searching for with such unwavering focus? Why did it return to the shadowed mouth of the storm drain day after day, as if drawn by an irresistible, unseen force? Little did Annie know that what lay hidden within that dark, forgotten tunnel would not only shock the quiet town, but also become the unexpected genesis of a small, everyday miracle. The early morning fog, a signature of Cedar Creek, hung low and heavy, clinging to the quaint streets as Annie Caldwell, her shoulders wrapped in the comforting warmth of her cardigan, made her way down Main Street towards Guthrie's butcher shop, her place of work for the past 15 years. At 58, Annie found solace in the predictable rhythm of her days, the familiar walk to work each morning, the gentle nod exchanged with Mrs. Patterson as she tended her vibrant geraniums, and the comforting aroma of freshly ground coffee, wafting from Harmon's diner. But this particular April morning carried a different undertone. The town had been relentlessly battered by spring storms for nearly 2 weeks, leaving the ground saturated, the usually placid creek swollen and turbulent, its banks overflowing. Cleanup crews were still diligently working to clear the debris of fallen branches and repair the snarl of damaged power lines, the aftermath of nature's recent fury. Annie carefully sidestepped a particularly deep puddle, a small victory in her soggy journey, grateful that the persistent rain had finally ceased 3 days prior. As she rounded the corner near the old post office, a fleeting movement at the periphery of her vision caught her eye. A quick flash of tawny fur and the distinctive bob of a short tail disappearing behind the overflowing dumpster at the edge of the municipal parking lot. Annie paused, her brow furrowing slightly as she squinted through the lingering mist. Wildlife sightings weren't entirely uncommon in Cedar Creek, nestled as it was against the vast expanse of the national forest. However, it was unusual to see a wild animal venturing so close to the busiest part of town, the hum of early morning activity already beginning to stir. Was that a bobcat? She murmured to herself, her steps slowing as she moved cautiously towards the hulking metal container. She peered around its edge, her breath catching in her throat as she saw the animal again. Unmistakably a bobcat, its lithe body slinking along the chain-link fence that bordered the small concrete drainage canal running behind the row of shops. Annie had always held a quiet fascination for bobcats. They were elusive creatures, masters of camouflage, rarely allowing themselves to be seen by human eyes. This one, however, seemed different, its usual wariness somehow diminished by a more pressing need. Even from a distance, Annie could discern that the animal was thin, its normally robust frame looking almost gaunt, the sharp angles of its bones more pronounced than they should have been. The bobcat paused near a dark, circular storm drain, lowering its pointed head to peer intently through the heavy metal grate before moving on with a restless energy. There was something almost desperate in the way it moved, a stark contrast to the confident, powerful predator Annie had occasionally glimpsed in the dense woods behind her small house on the outskirts of town. Throughout her shift at the butcher shop, The image of the thin, restless bobcat kept intruding upon Annie's thoughts, pulling her attention away from the familiar tasks. When her boss, Frank Guthrie, a man whose bushy eyebrows often mirrored his own quiet observations, noticed her persistent distraction as she meticulously trimmed a rack of lamb. He raised one of those expressive brows. "Something on your mind, Annie?" he asked, his voice laced with a gentle concern. "You've been a million miles away all morning." Annie, feeling a pang of guilt for her inattentiveness, explained what she had seen, carefully describing the bobcat's concerning appearance and its unusual behavior near the storm drain. Frank, a lifelong hunter and seasoned outdoorsman, listened thoughtfully, his calloused hands wiping absently on his stained apron. "Probably a female," he finally said, his gaze distant as he considered her words. "This time of year they might have kittens. Makes them take risks they normally wouldn't. Hunger will do that to a mother." When Annie's shift ended in the late afternoon, the image of the bobcat still lingered in her mind, a persistent worry she couldn't shake. Instead of heading directly home, her feet seemed to instinctively guide her on a detour past the municipal parking lot, her curiosity pulling her back to the place where she had first seen the wild creature. To her surprise, the bobcat was there, just as she had left it in her memory. This time it was crouched low to the ground near the entrance to the same storm drain, pacing back and forth with an evident agitation that tugged at Annie's heart. As Annie watched from a safe distance behind her parked car, the animal lowered itself onto its belly and stretched a delicate paw towards the dark opening of the drain, as if desperately trying to reach something hidden within its depths. A sudden, intuitive understanding struck Annie, a whisper of realization in the quiet of the late afternoon. "Oh my goodness," she breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. "Are there babies down there?" As if in response to her unspoken question, the bobcat's pointed ears twitched at the sound of Annie's soft voice, and it turned its head to look directly at her. Its amber eyes, usually sharp and wary, reflected a poignant mixture of weariness and a profound desperation that made Annie's heart clench with a sudden protective instinct. For a long, silent moment, woman and wild animal regarded each other, connected by an unspoken understanding that transcended the boundaries of species. Then, as quickly and silently as it had appeared, the bobcat darted away, its tawny form disappearing into the dense underbrush that lined the concrete drainage canal. Annie stood for several minutes, her mind racing with possibilities and a growing sense of urgency. If there were indeed bobcat kittens trapped in that dark drain, they wouldn't survive long without their mother's care. But Annie also knew better than to approach a storm drain alone, or to interfere with wildlife without the proper knowledge and expertise. The next morning, Annie arrived at Guthrie's butcher shop earlier than usual, her familiar tote bag feeling noticeably heavier than normal. Frank looked up from where he was meticulously grinding fresh sausage, his expression a silent question. "Frank," Annie began hesitantly, her voice a little softer than usual, "I was wondering if I could have some of the beef trimmings and organ meat you usually throw out." Frank's bushy eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Taking up exotic cooking, Annie?" he quipped, a hint of amusement in his tone. Annie quickly explained about the bobcat and her growing suspicions about the trapped kittens in the storm drain. "I thought, maybe if I left some food," she continued, her voice earnest, "I could at least help keep the mother alive while I figure out who to call about the kittens." To her immense relief, Frank didn't laugh or dismiss her concerns as the fanciful notions of an animal lover. Instead, he nodded thoughtfully and went to the walk-in cooler, returning a moment later with a paper-wrapped package that felt surprisingly heavy in Annie's hands. "Liver, heart, and some good beef scraps," he explained, his gaze meeting Annie's with a shared understanding. "If you're right about those kittens, their mama's going to need all the help she can get." With the precious package of meat secured in her bag, Annie made her way back to the municipal parking lot after her shift ended, her steps quick with a renewed sense of purpose. The area around the storm drain was quiet, the usual afternoon bustle of the small town having subsided, and there was no sign of the elusive bobcat. Carefully, Annie placed several generous pieces of the raw meat on a flat moss-covered rock about 20 feet away from the drain's opening, then retreated, to watch from the discreet cover of her parked car in the otherwise empty parking lot. It took nearly an hour of patient waiting before the Bobcat finally appeared, its sleek form slinking cautiously from the dense underbrush that lined the drainage canal. The animal paused, its nose twitching as it sniffed the air, clearly detecting the tempting scent of the meat, but still wary, its instincts cautioning it against a potential trap. Finally, the primal urge of hunger overcame its caution. The Bobcat approached the offerings with a swift, purposeful movement, quickly grabbing a large piece of liver in its sharp teeth. Then, to Annie's surprise, instead of immediately devouring it, the Bobcat carried the meat directly to the storm drain and dropped it carefully through the metal grate. It returned for another piece, which it ate quickly, its hunger evident in its rapid movements, before grabbing more and delivering it to the unseen depths of the drain. "I knew it," Annie whispered to herself, a mix of vindication and a deep wave of concern washing over her. Those poor babies. Over the next 3 days, Annie established a quiet routine. Each morning before work, and again in the late afternoon, she would leave a generous offering of meat for the Bobcat, watching from a distance as the animal meticulously divided each piece, consuming some itself, and carefully dropping the rest through the grate into the darkness below. The Bobcat seemed to be growing slightly less wary of Annie's presence, its initial skittishness slowly giving way to a grudging acceptance, though it still maintained a cautious distance, its wild instincts never fully subdued. On the 4th day, a growing unease and a powerful desire to help the trapped kittens compelled Annie to see exactly what she was dealing with. She arrived at the storm drain early in the morning, before the town had fully awakened, the air still cool and carrying the faint scent of damp earth. The mother Bobcat was nowhere in sight, likely out hunting in the nearby woods, Annie guessed, her heart pounding with a mixture of apprehension and determination. Gathering her courage, she approached the storm drain and knelt beside the cold metal grate, peering intently into the darkness below. At first, she saw nothing but the shadowed depths of the drain. Then, a small, almost imperceptible movement caught her eye, followed by a tiny, pitiful mewing sound, so fragile and filled with distress that it made Annie's heart constrict with a sudden wave of empathy. As her eyes gradually adjusted to the dim light filtering through the grate, Annie could make out several small, huddled forms in the concrete tunnel below. 5 Bobcat kittens, their spotted fur matted and dirty from their ordeal, their tiny eyes wide with fear and confusion as they looked up at her looming presence. "Oh, you poor things," Annie breathed, her voice a soft whisper of sympathy. The kittens couldn't be more than a few weeks old, their small bodies fragile and utterly dependent on their mother's care, far too young to survive on their own in the cold, unforgiving drain. Annie quickly assessed the situation. The storm drain was at least 6 feet deep, its smooth concrete walls offering no purchase for tiny claws. The kittens were trapped, and Annie realized with a sinking feeling that they must have fallen in during the recent flooding, perhaps washed away from their den when the drainage canals overflowed with the relentless rain. A soft, warning growl from behind her made Annie turn sharply, her heart leaping into her throat. The mother Bobcat stood about 15 feet away, a small, freshly caught bird clutched lifelessly in her jaws. Her posture was rigid, every muscle tense with protective instinct, her amber eyes fixed on Annie with a fierce intensity. "I'm not going to hurt them," Annie said softly, her voice calm despite the tremor of adrenaline that ran through her. She slowly rose and backed away from the drain, her hands held out in a gesture of peace. "But they need more help than you can give them, Mama." Back home, the urgency of the situation propelled Annie into action. She spent the evening hunched over her laptop, researching local wildlife rescue organizations, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She finally found the Blue Ridge Wildlife Center, a reputable organization that specialized in the rehabilitation of native Virginia wildlife. When she explained the precarious situation to the woman who answered the phone, A wave of immediate concern resonated through the line. "Bobcat kittens in a storm drain?" the woman asked, her voice sharp with worry. "How long have they been there?" The woman, who introduced herself as Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the center's veterinarian, listened intently as Annie recounted her observations. "I'm not sure exactly, but at least 4 days since I first noticed the mother," Annie replied, her voice filled with anxiety. "Probably longer." It took nearly an hour of patient waiting before the bobcat finally appeared, its sleek form slinking cautiously from the dense underbrush that lined the drainage canal. The animal paused, its nose twitching as it sniffed the air, clearly detecting the tempting scent of the meat, but still wary, its instincts cautioning it against a potential trap. Finally, the primal urge of hunger overcame its caution. The bobcat approached the offerings with a swift, purposeful movement, quickly grabbing a large piece of liver in its sharp teeth. Then, to Annie's surprise, instead of immediately devouring it, the bobcat carried the meat directly to the storm drain and dropped it carefully through the metal grate. It returned for another piece, which it ate quickly, its hunger evident in its rapid movements, before grabbing more and delivering it to the unseen depths of the drain. "I knew it," Annie whispered to herself, a mix of vindication and a deep wave of concern washing over her. Those poor babies. Over the next 3 days, Annie established a quiet routine. Each morning before work and again in the late afternoon, she would leave a generous offering of meat for the bobcat, watching from a distance as the animal meticulously divided each piece, consuming some itself, and carefully dropping the rest through the grate into the darkness below. The bobcat seemed to be growing slightly less wary of Annie's presence, its initial skittishness slowly giving way to a grudging acceptance, though it still maintained a cautious distance, its wild instincts never fully subdued. On the 4th day, a growing unease and a powerful desire to help the trapped kittens compelled Annie to see exactly what she was dealing with. She arrived at the storm drain early in the morning, before the town had fully awakened, the air still cool and carrying the faint scent of damp earth. The mother bobcat was nowhere in sight, likely out hunting in the nearby woods, Annie guessed, her heart pounding with a mixture of apprehension and determination. Gathering her courage, she approached the storm drain and knelt beside the cold metal grate, peering intently into the darkness below. At first, she saw nothing but the shadowed depths of the drain. Then a small, almost imperceptible movement caught her eye, followed by a tiny, pitiful mewing sound, so fragile and filled with distress that it made Annie's heart constrict with a sudden wave of empathy. As her eyes gradually adjusted to the dim light filtering through the grate, Annie could make out several small, huddled forms in the concrete tunnel below. 5 bobcat kittens, their spotted fur matted and dirty from their ordeal, their tiny eyes wide with fear and confusion as they looked up at her looming presence. "Oh, you poor things," Annie breathed, her voice a soft whisper of sympathy. The kittens couldn't be more than a few weeks old, their small bodies fragile and utterly dependent on their mother's care, far too young to survive on their own in the cold, unforgiving drain. Annie quickly assessed the situation. The storm drain was at least 6 feet deep, its smooth concrete walls offering no purchase for tiny claws. The kittens were trapped, and Annie realized with a sinking feeling that they must have fallen in during the recent flooding, perhaps washed away from their den when the drainage canals overflowed with the relentless rain. A soft, warning growl from behind her made Annie turn sharply, her heart leaping into her throat. The mother bobcat stood about 15 feet away, a small, freshly caught bird clutched lifelessly in her jaws. Her posture was rigid, every muscle tense with protective instinct, her amber eyes fixed on Annie with a fierce intensity. "I'm not going to hurt them," Annie said softly, her voice calm despite the tremor of adrenaline that ran through her. She slowly rose and backed away from the drain, her hands held out in a gesture of peace. "But they need more help than you can give them, Mama." Back home, the urgency of the situation propelled Annie into action. She spent the evening hunched over her laptop, researching local wildlife rescue organizations, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She finally found the Blue Ridge Wildlife Center, a reputable organization that specialized in the rehabilitation of native Virginia wildlife. When she explained the precarious situation to the woman who answered the phone, a wave of immediate concern resonated through the line. "Bobcat kittens in a storm drain?" the woman asked, her voice sharp with worry. "How long have they been there?" The woman, who introduced herself as Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the center's veterinarian, listened intently as Annie recounted her observations. "I'm not sure exactly, but at least 4 days since I first noticed the mother," Annie replied, her voice filled with anxiety. "Probably longer. We had severe flooding last week." A grave tone entered Dr. Rodriguez's voice. "This is very concerning. If they've been trapped that long, they could be suffering from exposure, dehydration, and malnutrition, even with the mother trying to feed them. We need to get them out as soon as possible." The rescue was tentatively scheduled for the following morning, a beacon of hope in the darkness of Annie's worry. Annie arrived at the storm drain at the first hint of dawn, the eastern sky just beginning to lighten, to find 2 vehicles already parked nearby, their presence a reassuring sign of swift action. A van bearing the distinctive logo of the Blue Ridge Wildlife Center sat alongside a familiar municipal works truck. Dr. Rodriguez, a petite woman with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, was already conferring with a city worker about the safest and most efficient way to remove the heavy drain cover. "You must be Annie," Dr. Rodriguez said, extending a warm hand towards her. "Thank you for calling us. So many people would have just ignored this situation or, even worse, called animal control to trap the mother as a nuisance." Annie shook her hand, a sense of relief washing over her. "I couldn't just leave them there. The poor mother has been desperately trying to care for them." Dr. Rodriguez nodded, her expression serious. "Speaking of which, we need to be prepared for her to return. Bobcats are incredibly protective of their young. My assistant Jake is a trained wildlife handler." She gestured towards a tall, bearded man who was carefully removing equipment from the back of the van. "He'll be ready with a catch pole and a transport crate if we need to temporarily contain the mother for the kitten's safety." The city worker, a middle-aged man named Tom, whom Annie recognized from around town, used a specialized tool to carefully lift the heavy metal grate. As it finally came free, everyone gathered cautiously around the opening, and Jake shone a powerful flashlight into the dark, damp depths of the drain. Huddled together in a small, relatively dry section of the concrete pipe were the 5 tiny kittens. They blinked in the sudden intrusion of light, their small faces a poignant mixture of fear and a hesitant curiosity. "They're alive!" Annie exclaimed, a wave of relief washing over her. Dr. Rodriguez nodded, her professional demeanor softening, her eyes reflecting a quiet compassion. "Yes, and they don't look as bad as I feared. Their mother has done an amazing job keeping them alive." Jake prepared a long-handled net and a soft-sided carrier, his movements efficient and gentle. "I'll try to get them all at once to minimize stress," he explained to Annie, his voice calm and reassuring. "The less time we spend here, the better for everyone, especially if Mama comes back." As if on cue, a low, warning growl emanated from the dense bushes along the drainage canal. The mother bobcat had returned, her sleek body crouched low to the ground, her ears flattened against her head, her amber eyes fixed intently on the humans surrounding her precious kittens. "Nobody make any sudden movements," Dr. Rodriguez said, calmly, her voice low and steady. "Tom, can you and Annie step back a bit to give her some space?" Annie and Tom retreated several yards, their hearts pounding with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation, while Dr. Rodriguez spoke in a soft, even tone, as if the wild mother could somehow understand her gentle reassurances. "We're helping your babies, Mama. Just a few more minutes." Jake worked quickly but with painstaking care, using the net to scoop up all 5 tiny kittens in one swift, gentle motion. Their frightened mews triggered an immediate protective response from their mother, who darted forward a few steps, her body tense before stopping, torn between her fierce instinct to protect her young and her inherent wariness of the surrounding humans. Got them, Jake said softly, transferring the wriggling kittens to the safety of the soft-sided carrier. He then stepped back slowly and deliberately from the open drain, giving the anxious mother more space. Dr. Rodriguez approached the carrier and peered inside, quickly assessing the tiny occupants. 3 males, 2 females, approximately 4 weeks old, she reported, her voice matter-of-fact but her gaze gentle. They're dehydrated and underweight, but alert and responsive. No obvious injuries. The mother bobcat paced anxiously nearby, her low growls a constant reminder of her distress, but she maintained a cautious distance, her protective instincts warring with her fear of the humans. Got them, Jake said softly, transferring the wriggling kittens to the safety of the soft-sided carrier. He then stepped back slowly and deliberately from the open drain, giving the anxious mother more space. Dr. Rodriguez approached the carrier and peered inside, quickly assessing the tiny occupants. 3 males, 2 females, approximately 4 weeks old, she reported, her voice matter-of-fact but her gaze gentle. They're dehydrated and underweight, but alert and responsive. No obvious injuries. The mother bobcat paced anxiously nearby, her low growls a constant reminder of her distress, but she maintained a cautious distance, her protective instincts warring with her fear of the humans. Annie felt tears welling in her eyes as she watched the conflicted animal, understanding viscerally the profound depth of maternal instinct that had driven her to such extraordinary lengths to keep her vulnerable kittens alive. What happens now? Annie asked softly, her voice thick with emotion. Ideally, we'd reunite them with their mother as soon as possible, Dr. Rodriguez explained, her tone practical but compassionate. Bobcat kittens have the best chance of survival when raised by their mother. But we can't simply release them here. They'd likely end up back in that drain or facing other urban hazards. A thought sparked in Annie's mind. What about relocation? She suggested, her voice hopeful. I live at the edge of town. My property backs up against the national forest. There's a wooded area on my property with an old shed I never use. It would be a safe place for them to recover, away from the town, but still protected. Dr. Rodriguez considered this possibility, her brow furrowed in thought. That could work, Dr. Rodriguez mused, her brow furrowed in thought. We'd need to examine and treat the kittens first, make sure they're stable. Then, we could create a temporary den in your shed, release the kittens there and try to trap and relocate the mother to the same location. You think she'd find them, Annie? Bobcats have an incredible sense of smell and remarkable determination, Dr. Rodriguez assured her, a hint of admiration in her voice. From what you've told me about this mother, I have no doubt she'll find her way to her kittens. The next 48 hours unfolded in a blur of activity. The tiny bobcat kittens were carefully transported to the Blue Ridge Wildlife Center, where they received fluids to combat dehydration, treatment for any potential parasites, and a thorough health check by the dedicated veterinary staff. Meanwhile, wildlife officials discreetly set up a humane trap near the storm drain, carefully baited with fresh meat and the irresistible scent of her missing offspring. By the second evening, their patient efforts paid off. They had successfully captured the anxious mother bobcat. Annie received a call from Dr. Rodriguez around sunset, her voice carrying a note of quiet triumph. We've got her, the veterinarian reported. She's in good condition considering what she's been through, just underweight and exhausted. We're going to keep the family overnight for observation, and if all goes well, we can attempt the relocation to your property tomorrow. Annie spent the following morning preparing the old, unused shed at the back of her property, with a nervous excitement fluttering in her stomach. Following Dr. Rodriguez's detailed instructions, she cleaned it thoroughly, removing years of accumulated dust and cobwebs. Then she carefully created a den-like space in one corner using soft straw and a few strategically placed branches, mimicking the natural shelters bobcats preferred. She made sure the shed had multiple potential exit points, allowing the wild family to come and go as they needed, but also ensuring it was secure enough to keep them safe from any immediate threats. Around noon, the familiar van from the blue, Ridge Wildlife Center pulled up her long gravel driveway, bringing with it the promise of a hopeful reunion. Dr. Rodriguez and Jake carefully carried two separate containers, a larger crate containing the sedated mother bobcat, her breathing slow and even, and a smaller carrier filled with the 5 kittens, now looking considerably more lively and alert than when Annie had first seen their frightened faces in the darkness of the storm drain. "We've given the mother a mild sedative," Dr. Rodriguez explained softly, as they made their way towards the prepared shed, their footsteps crunching on the gravel path. "It will wear off in about an hour, which gives us ample time to get the kittens settled in their new den and then retreat to a safe distance before she wakes up." Inside the quiet of the shed, Jake gently placed the carrier containing the kittens in the prepared den space. The tiny creatures, their spotted coats now clean and fluffy, sniffed their new surroundings with a cautious curiosity, eventually huddling together for comfort, their small bodies blending seamlessly with the soft straw. Finally, they carefully positioned the larger crate with the still sedated mother bobcat near the kitten's den, but strategically facing away from them, towards the open doorway of the shed. "When she wakes up," Dr. Rodriguez explained, her voice a low murmur, "she'll be able to immediately catch the scent of her kittens. Her head will naturally turn towards them." They then secured the shed door with a simple latch that could be easily opened from the outside using a long length of rope. "We'll pull the rope to open the door once we're all at a safe distance, and when she's fully alert, her powerful maternal instincts should take over, guiding her to her young." The 3 humans retreated to the quiet sanctuary of Annie's back porch, which offered a clear, unobstructed view of the old shed about 100 yards away. Jake carefully set up a spotting scope, allowing them to observe the anticipated reunion from a distance that wouldn't cause any unnecessary stress to the wild animals. "Now we wait," Dr. Rodriguez said softly, accepting the steaming mug of coffee Annie offered, the warmth a comforting contrast to the cool spring air. It was nearly an hour of tense anticipation before they saw any movement within the darkened interior of the shed. Through the lens of the spotting scope, they watched as the mother bobcat finally began to stir, rising unsteadily to her feet. She appeared disoriented for a few fleeting moments, her head swaying slightly, then froze, her senses clearly picking up the unmistakable scent of her kittens. Her head swiveled slowly until her gaze locked onto the small, huddled forms in their nest of straw. "Pull the rope now," Dr. Rodriguez instructed softly, her voice barely a whisper. With a gentle tug, Annie pulled the rope, and the shed door swung inward a few inches, allowing a sliver of daylight to penetrate the interior. The mother bobcat noticed the sudden change immediately, her attention divided between the newly opened exit and the precious bundles of fur in their straw-filled den. For several tense moments she seemed torn between the instinct to flee and the undeniable pull of her maternal bond. Then one of the tiny kittens let out a soft, plaintive mew, a sound that seemed to break through her disorientation and fear. The mother moved swiftly and purposefully towards her babies, sniffing each one thoroughly, her nose nudging them gently, as if taking a careful inventory, ensuring all were present and unharmed. Apparently satisfied that her family was complete and safe, she settled down beside them, allowing the hungry kittens to instinctively nuzzle and nurse for the first time since their terrifying ordeal had begun. "That's a good sign," Dr. Rodriguez said, her professional demeanor softening with evident relief. "She's accepted them and the new den site. The hardest part is over." Over the following weeks, Annie maintained a respectful distance, allowing the wild family the space they needed to recover, but she kept a careful, watchful eye on the old shed and the surrounding woods. The Blue Ridge Wildlife Center provided supplemental food, nutrient-rich prey items, which Annie discreetly left at the edge of the woods, far enough from the shed to avoid habituating the bobcats to human presence, but close enough to ensure the nursing mother had adequate nutrition to care for her growing litter. Dr. Rodriguez visited weekly, observing the family's progress from afar with the aid of binoculars, and offering Annie valuable advice on their natural behaviors and developmental milestones. By early June, the kittens had grown remarkably, their once frail bodies now round and playful, They had begun venturing cautiously outside the shed under their mother's watchful eye, their tiny paws exploring the unfamiliar textures of the forest floor. They practiced pouncing on fallen leaves and playfully wrestling with each other, honing the essential skills they would need for survival in the wild. "They're right on track developmentally," Dr. Rodriguez told Annie during one of her visits, a smile gracing her lips. "The mother is teaching them vital hunting skills, and they're growing more independent each day. In another month or so, they'll likely be ready for a full release back into the vastness of the forest." "Will they stay around here?" Annie asked, an unexpected pang of attachment tugging at her heart. "Bobcats typically establish territories of 1 to 5 square miles," Dr. Rodriguez explained. "The mother may very well keep this area as part of her range since it's proven safe and has good resources. The kittens, however, will eventually disperse to establish their own territories, probably by late fall." When July arrived, bringing with it the thick humidity and frequent afternoon thunderstorms of a Virginia summer, the Bobcat family spent less and less time near the old shed. Annie would occasionally glimpse them at dawn or dusk, the mother leading her now adolescent offspring along the shadowy edges of the forest, their movements becoming increasingly confident and predatory with each passing day. One quiet evening, as Annie sat on her back porch, watching the mesmerizing dance of fireflies rising from the dew-kissed meadow, she noticed a subtle movement at the tree line. The mother bobcat stood there alone, her tawny coat glowing in the last warm light of the day. For several long minutes, the wild animal gazed steadily at Annie, neither retreating into the shadows nor approaching the porch. In that silent, profound moment of connection, Annie felt something intangible pass between them, an acknowledgement perhaps of the unlikely alliance that had saved 5 precious young lives. Then, with a flick of her short, stubby tail, the bobcat turned and melted seamlessly into the gathering darkness of the forest. By August, the bobcat family had fully transitioned back to their wild existence, no longer using the shed and appearing only fleetingly in the deeper, more secluded parts of the woods. Dr. Rodriguez officially declared the rehabilitation a complete success during her final visit to Annie's property. "You've done something truly remarkable here, Annie," she said, her voice filled with genuine admiration as they shared a glass of iced tea on the porch. "Most people never get to witness the kind of fierce dedication that mothers in the wild display, let alone play such a vital role in helping wild creatures overcome such incredible odds." "I'm the lucky one," Annie replied softly, her gaze drifting towards the now silent forest that had briefly sheltered her wild family. "I've lived in Cedar Creek all my life, walked past that storm drain thousands of times without really seeing. Now I notice everything. Every bird call, every rustle in the underbrush. It's like the world got bigger somehow." Dr. Rodriguez smiled knowingly. "That's what these wild connections do for us, Annie. They remind us that we're all part of something much larger than ourselves." That fall, as the leaves of the Appalachian foothills turned into a breathtaking tapestry of crimson and gold, Annie often walked the familiar trails behind her house, always keeping a hopeful eye out for a fleeting glimpse of spotted fur or the distinctive flash of a bobbed tail. Sometimes, on particularly quiet mornings, she was rewarded with a brief sighting, most memorably a young bobcat intently practicing its stalking skills on an oblivious squirrel. Annie knew she couldn't be absolutely certain it was one of her rescued kittens, but in the quiet corners of her heart she chose to believe it was. The town of Cedar Creek, too, had undergone a subtle transformation. The heartwarming story of the storm drain rescue had spread through the community, inspiring the city council to implement plans for wildlife corridors and more ecologically sound drainage systems, recognizing the importance of coexisting with the wild creatures that shared their mountain home. Frank from the butcher shop, touched by Annie's dedication, became an unlikely but reliable donor to the Blue Ridge Wildlife Center, providing weekly donations of fresh meat for their ongoing rehabilitation efforts. Local schools invited Dr. Rodriguez to give engaging presentations about native wildlife, fostering a new generation of conservation-minded citizens. As for Annie, She continued her quiet life, her days still centered around the familiar routine of the butcher shop, but with one significant and deeply fulfilling change. She had begun volunteering at the Blue Ridge Wildlife Center on weekends, her gentle patience and quiet understanding proving invaluable in helping other wild mothers and their vulnerable youngsters find their way back to where they belonged. On cold winter nights, when the wind howled around her small house, carrying the distant cries of unseen creatures, Annie would sometimes think about the determined Bobcat mother and the extraordinary lengths she had gone to for her kittens. It reminded her of something her own mother used to say, that love, at its most elemental and fierce, was the same in all creatures, a powerful, unwavering determination to protect what was precious against whatever odds the world might present. And in the years that followed, whenever Annie passed a storm drain or caught the distant, haunting cry of a bobcat echoing through the hills, she felt that quiet connection renew itself, a delicate thread woven between species, between the wild and the tame, between what is lost and what, against all odds, is found again.